Good morning and welcome back to another virtual edition of Children's Church. We are in the middle of an epic battle story, so we had best jump back into it, all right? Let's go for it. There was a lot of things that happened last week. We had Jonathan, who is King Saul's son, all right? He and his armor bearer, the guy who helped him out with his armor and carrying it around for battle, that kind of thing, just the two of them snuck away from King Saul and all of Israel's armies, and they went and decided to attack the Philistines. And God showed up in this crazy way, in this unexpected, miraculous way, and he just brought all this chaos and confusion to the Philistine camp. The Philistines started fighting against each other, not realizing what was going on, even though it was just two people, just Jonathan and his armor bearer, that were actually fighting against them. And so God, he is having his way in the Philistine camp. He's having his way against his people's enemy. And so King Saul, he catches wind that there's something happening, and next thing you know, King Saul and all of Israel's armies are fighting against the Philistines, and they are being victorious. Why? Because God showed up. Because Jonathan, Saul's son, had faith and trusted that God was moving and working, and so he was willing to fight alongside, and this crazy thing was happening. Now, everything was pretty good and exciting, and we know that King Saul, he was like, hey, let's not stop now, let's keep on going. But unfortunately, we also know that King Saul likes to mess things up because he doesn't always follow God and trust God as he should. So let's see what happens today. We are, as you should know by now, in 1 Samuel, and today we're starting at chapter 14, and we're picking up right where we left off last week. So we've had this great defeat against the Philistines at Gibeah, and King Saul, he wants to keep on keeping on and destroying more Philistine enemies that are in different places. And so I am at verse 23 in chapter 14. Let's go. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Beth-aven. And the men of Israel had been hard-pressed that day, right? So hard-pressed. They had just been really struggling and fighting. It's been a lot of work, a lot of exercise, because you're fighting and running and marching and traveling, all that good stuff. But Saul, he laid an oath on the people, saying, "Cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged on my enemies." So none of the people tasted food. After all of that fighting and all of the marching and running and all of that craziness of battle, they weren't allowed to eat food because Saul, he made this vow, this oath that would say you can't eat food until we destroy the enemy. And somehow if they didn't eat food, then they would have a better chance of fighting against the enemy. But that doesn't make any, Saul, King Saul, what are you doing? He's trying to make up something of if we don't eat, then God will somehow now be able to defeat the Philistines. But if we do eat, then it's not gonna work out. This doesn't make any sense. Now you have to understand something here. When Israel was defeating the Philistines in Gibeah and then Beth-aven, all these different places, it wasn't like they were out in the middle of nowhere and there was no food around, and Saul was like, you can't go back to our camp and get food. As they were going through these different areas, the Philistines had been camping out at these places. They had tons of food that they were all eating with their soldiers and whatnot, lying around, ready to be taken and enjoyed. But Israel wasn't allowed to touch any of it. It'd be like if I was super, super hungry and really wanted something sweet, and I walked in and there was all this ice cream and soda and chips and Jimmy's and sprinkles, and then somebody said, sorry, can't touch it. And I'm like, but I'm starving. I think I'm gonna faint if I don't get something. But I wasn't allowed to eat it anyways. That's what's going on here with the Israelite army. And as a matter of fact, it got even more tempting to eat food. Just wait. Now, Israel, they eventually came to this forest, woods full of trees. And the craziest thing was happening. As they're walking around, there were all these puddles on the ground of honey. Like sweet, delicious honey. And the reason why there were puddles of honey on the ground is because honey was literally dripping down off of the trees right onto the ground. There was honey everywhere. It must have been delicious, sweet, and amazing. But the Israelites couldn't actually eat the honey because Saul said that anyone who eats honey will be cursed. That's pretty serious. So they're not eating honey, but King Saul, his son Jonathan, didn't hear his dad's oath, vow, thing that he made. And so Jonathan, he takes his staff and he dips his staff into the honey and he tastes it. And let's see what happens. By the way, Pirate's Booty, so good. It's like salty, crunchy, cheesy, got a little bit of that like bite to it because of the aged white cheddar. Highly recommend if you're looking for a snack. Gluten-free, not dairy-free, but gluten-free. Today's video was brought to you by the letter C for cheddar, like aged white cheddar. Ugh, so good, right? Am I right? Jonathan did the very thing that his father had commanded the people not to do, and he was supposed to be cursed. So let's find out what happens. This is verse 25. Now, when all the people came to the forest, behold, there was honey on the ground. And when the people entered the forest, behold, the honey was dropping. But no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. They were not going to eat this honey because they knew that they would be cursed if they did. But Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with the oath. So he put out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth. And his eyes became bright. Then one of the people said, "Your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, 'Cursed be the man who eats food this day.'" And the people were faint. So all the other people, they hadn't eaten anything all day, and so they're like ready to pass out because they're just so tired and so weak and so hungry. But Jonathan, when he ate the honey, his eyes were bright because he was like, "Sugar, that's what I needed. I have sustenance and strength to keep on fighting. Honey, sugar high," whatever. All right, then now, see the difference there? He was like, the honey actually was like helpful to him to have energy, to be able to keep on moving and fighting and ready to do what God wanted him to do. But the other people, they couldn't eat, so they were like, "I'm gonna pass out." All right, now, Jonathan hears that there was a curse for any person who ate food. And so verse 29 says, "Then Jonathan said, 'My father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright because I tasted a little of this honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies that they found. For now, the defeat among the Philistines has not been great.'" Jonathan knew that his father had made this vow without thinking. He had just come up with this in his anger and in his desire to defeat people, and he hadn't actually thought things through. And he's like, man, if the people had just been able to eat food, and there was plenty of food to eat because we were like defeating them Philistines and there was all this food left behind, we could have had a feast. The people would have been so much stronger and better and ready to fight, and the victory would have been greater. But because Saul was just like not thinking and just made this rash, quick decision, the whole country was being negatively affected by it. And now his own son was supposed to be cursed? Now, when the night finally came, the people could eat, but they didn't feel like, turning on the barbecue and cooking all their food, so they did something they weren't supposed to do. The people started to make their dinner, some lamb, some beef, but they were impatient and they didn't wait until the meat was properly cooked. And they started eating it before it was actually done, and this was going against the Hebrew, Jewish, Mosaic law that they were supposed to follow, God's law for the people. They were not supposed to eat meat that was not properly cooked. So the people started sitting against God because they were so hungry they just didn't feel like doing what they were supposed to do. So this means that, because of this harsh, rash vow that Saul made, his son Jonathan, he's not aware of this yet, has been cursed by him. And now all of the people are really tempted to do something that goes against God by eating this meat before it's fully cooked. And so they're sinning against God. And so, yeah, this is just going downhill fast. King Saul, what were you thinking? Now, there's a lot that happens in the story, so let me speed up through some of it. So we have Jonathan. He ate the honey, so he's kind of cursed by his father. Though his father didn't know they ate the honey yet. That'll come in later. And then we have all of Israel that was sinning against God because they were eating that meat before it was properly cooked. And according to their Jewish law, they were not allowed to do that. So they were not following after what God wanted them to do. Not good. And so King Saul, he's like, wait a second, this probably isn't a good thing that, the people are sinning against God, because we're kind of relying on God to, defeat the Philistines right now. So King Saul sets up an altar, and he has a sacrifice done so that the people's sins would be forgiven. He's like, whew, all right, that's good. But he's like, you know what? Just in case, I don't know what our relationship with God is right now as a country. So he calls over Abijah. If you remember Abijah, he's one of the priests, and he's the priest that King Saul brought along with him to the war. And so he's like, yo, Abijah, you're a priest. You seem to have an in with the big man. So I have a favor for you. Could you ask God if he's actually still with us and is gonna fight for us so we will defeat the Philistines? Because I want to go to battle, I want to defeat them, but I don't want to go to battle and try to defeat them if they're actually going to defeat us and it's not going to go well. So if you could just figure out what we're supposed to do, that'd be wonderful. So Abijah, he asks God what they should do next. Should they go and fight against the Philistines? Will God fight for them on their side? And he doesn't hear anything back. He doesn't hear anything from God. He has no sense as to what they're supposed to do, but he does have a sense of why he's not hearing from God. Today's video was brought to you by the letter C for crunchy. Do you hear the crunch on these? Just, so good, so good. We are in verse 37 of chapter 14. And Saul inquired of God, or Saul asked God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel? Or in other words, if we go fight against the Philistines, will you let us win? But God did not answer King Saul that day. And Saul said, come here, all you leaders of the people, and know and see how this sin has arisen today. So King Saul, if he believes that God is not answering him because somebody has sinned, somebody has made a mistake, and he doesn't know who it was. Now, it wasn't all the people that had eaten the meat that they weren't supposed to eat because they hadn't cooked it correctly. They had already been forgiven for that because of the sacrifice and all that good stuff. So we're kind of beyond that point, but King Saul is like, there's somebody else out there who has made a mistake. Maybe it's you, King Saul. You've made a few mistakes, but so he thinks that that's the reason that God will not answer him. So he says, for as the Lord lives who saves Israel, though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. Even if the person who sinned was Jonathan, my own son, whoever it is, they will surely die. Well, believe it or not, nobody came up. Nobody was like, oh, King Saul, it was me. I'm the person, you can kill me. I was the reason, I made the mistake. Yet nobody said anything. And so King Saul comes up with an idea and he's like, all right, that's it. We are splitting up into two big groups, all right? So everybody in Israel, you stand over there. And then me and my son Jonathan are gonna stand over here. And we're gonna pull out the Urim and Thummim and figure out who it was. Remember when we talked about casting lots, kind of like rolling dice or flipping a coin? That's what he was. It was like he was like, all right, I'm gonna flip a coin, and if it lands on heads, then that means that you all in Israel, it's one of you people that are messing up. But if it lands on tails, then it's either myself or Jonathan. And he looked, and sure enough, it landed on tails, which means that it was either him or Jonathan. And they did it again, and it landed on Jonathan. And he knew that Jonathan was the guilty one. But what had Jonathan done? Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you have done. And Jonathan told him, I tasted a little honey with the tip of the staff that was in my hand. Here I am. I will die. Jonathan, he doesn't even try to argue. He doesn't complain. He doesn't give an excuse. He didn't know that his father had made that vow that nobody should taste any food or he'll be cursed, right? Well, King Saul, this is his response. And Saul said, God do so to me and more also. You shall surely die, Jonathan. King Saul, he decided, he's like, look, I made that vow. And then again, I said that whoever sinned, that they need to die. And it would be going against God for me to do anything but to have you be put to death, Jonathan. Sorry, there's no other way around it. What? Saul, you were the one that made this harsh, rash, sudden vow that the people couldn't eat. You were the one that said, hey, somebody sinned in the camp and then whoever it is, they need to die. It wasn't God telling you these things. You were telling yourself these things. Like, what in the world are you thinking? Well, the people, they were not having it. And the people said to Saul, shall Jonathan die, who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So the people ransomed Jonathan, so he did not die. The people had saved Jonathan from his father's cruelty and harshness and rashness. And what in the world are you thinking? The people, they knew that Jonathan was a person who loved God, who followed God, who trusted God and had faith in God. It was because of that faith that God was able to use Jonathan in this crazy way where the Philistines were taken out, right? We know that from the last story from last week. Why in the world would you punish this person who hasn't done anything wrong? King Saul, you're the one who is out of line. You might think that I'm being harsh to King Saul, or maybe you're thinking that I'm not harsh enough to King Saul. I don't know. But I think that part of that is because I know the rest of the story. And King Saul, he just continues down this road where he lets his emotions, his anger, his impatience kind of dictate what he's going to do. He allows his emotions to tell him to do this thing or that thing, and everyone else has to deal with the consequences of his own messed upness. And it's just going to get worse and worse. But I'm thankful, as I'm reminded, that Samuel already told King Saul that he was not going to be on this throne for forever, that there would be a new king that would come up. Well, then again, Jonathan, his son, is pretty cool sounding. I mean, he really does love God. I feel like he does deserve to be king, but because of King Saul's sin, this kingdom would not continue to be through his line, through his family, and King Saul is going to come to an end, and there will be a new king coming to the throne, and I am looking forward to that. Today's video was brought to you by the letter C for Corn Puffs. Man, put some cheese on them Corn Puffs, sign me up. We are back in my favorite place to sing worship songs in, the bathroom. But in all honesty, we are going to sing a worship song, and this song is about following after God. Because King Saul, he kind of did his own thing sometimes, and it got himself and everybody else into lots of trouble a lot of the time. But if we're supposed to be people who love God, we should be following after him, step by step. From the morning to the evening, no matter where we are, we should be listening to God and doing what he wants us to do. So this song is a prayer of kind of commitment, of saying, God, I want to follow you step by step, wherever it is that you're leading me, all right? So as you catch on to it, feel free to sing along. Oh God, you are my God, and I will ever praise you. Oh God, you are my God, and I will ever praise you. I will seek you in the morning, and I will learn to walk in your way. long, and hopefully that's your prayer and your desire too. Today's video was brought to you by the letter C for confession, and I have a confession to make. That I love me some pirate's booty, like get in my belly! This song goes out to something that I just really love and cherish. Alright, here we go. I need to get me some pirate's booty, that aged white cheddar crunchy tasty stuff. The name is silly, but my heart's not joking. I need more of those tasty cheesy puffs. Pirate's booty.